I'll be refuting the claim today that the EU's Article 13 at its current state would have detrimental effects outweigh benefits on social media. I have reason to believe that we have been misled with insufficient evidence and questionable reasoning. The EU's Article 13, despite the controversy surrounding it, carries much more of a beneficial impact rather than negative as being suggested. My 3 points I will use today to support this is challenging our fair use isn't exactly a bad thing. Private companies are not responsible for social media's heavy reliance on shared info, and that the evidence and reasoning used against this is questionable at best. So my first point is challenging our fair use of internet is not exactly a bad thing. It creates a chance to set common sense limitations. For example, cartel and Islamic extremist murder videos not be seen. Also in recent history, the first person slaying of Alison Parker and Adam Ward, the broadcast journalist, would not have been uploaded and be able to be spread so well. It also limits the harmful activities. There are dark areas of the web that allow access to drug and human trafficking as well as child pornography. The normal character we're hearing about nowadays within Peppa Pig and other children programs that encourage them to inflict self-harm would also be erased through the censorship. By restricting content that can be accessed, it limits the opportunities that predators can create to find their new victims. It also prevents fake news. Claims of fake news has increased dramatically in recent years. Fake news websites promote false reports for money through clicks because the readers believe that is true. Internet censorship would provide another level of discernment, which leads me to my second point. Private companies and other entities are now responsible for social media's heavy reliance on shared content. Article 13 is not hell-bent to completely restrict information as is being implied. Chris Fox's What is Article 13? The EU's Copyright Directive Explained has a direct quote. Content sharing services must obtain license-protected copyrighted material from the rights holders. If that is not possible and the material is posted on the service, the company can be held liable unless they can demonstrate that it made the best efforts to get permission from the copyright holder, made its best efforts to ensure the material specified by right holder was not made available, and that if they acted quickly to remove any infringing material, that it was made aware. Awareness brings me to my last point. The reasoning and evidence in this use is questionable at best. The source of the most bold statements. The source for one of the most bold statements made comes from an incredibly biased and motivated source. Over hundreds of thousands of jobs will be lost from Article 13 if it's put into law. Where were these numbers? How did you get these numbers? How could you figure? What's the truth behind this? The definitely left us hanging, and it's not a very credible source. It comes from a blog, which is not credible. A whole point was not even explained, nor it also was softly mentioned. Article 13 will limit small creators. I know plenty of small creators that are original without using other people's words and materials to express themselves. It seems to me that small creators are having issue with creativity, not so much being able to use other people's works. And at best, the argument is that I cannot use someone else's words or materials to express myself. Why is this important? What's the concept behind this? Why are we talking about this? In closing, challenging our fair use of internet is not a bad thing as it asserts common sense limitations. Private companies are not responsible for social media's heavy reliance on shared content, as this is the fault of the industry, not the companies. And lastly, the reasoning and evidence in use is questionable at best. Article 13 will make the internet a more safe and honest space for everyone. Thank you.
All right, Joe, you've got a good identification of the topic that you're responding to, but most of your argument seems to be kind of its own sort of issue. You've created a structure for a counterclaim instead of actually responding to the claims presented by the advocate. That's not automatically a bad thing. I think some of those things that you presented as counterclaims are probably very applicable to some of the argument that was being made by the advocate. But it does seem to ignore whatever grounds and warrant the advocate offered in support of their position, because I don't hear you, except on the third point where you made a reference to the evidence that they use coming from a blog site that's probably biased and not readily qualified. I didn't hear anything else about the rest of their argument and about what the possible implications are. You had basically a couple of good counterclaims. The first one is that challenges on the fair use policy are not necessarily a bad thing, and you've got a couple of examples that you make reference to, some of the things that happen with the information that's being spread around online. How some of that fits into the fair use elements of Article 13, I'm not quite clear, but you seem to have made a connection there between some of the extremist stuff that appears online and that's allowable because we don't have a restriction like they have on Article 13. The MoMA thing probably does fit a little bit more clearly in that category because it would be one of those copyrighted things that couldn't be distributed that way or changed around that way. The other ones, I'm not sure how they fit into that category. The province of fake news also is one of those things where, well, I know that fake news is a problem online. It's not quite clear to me how Article 13 addresses that issue. And so although I think it's probably a relevant issue, it's not explained as clearly why it's relevant on that particular point. I wasn't quite clear on what the second point was, except that the idea is that responsible companies wouldn't really be in a problematic situation because if there was a violation, all they had to do was show that they were trying to comply, that they'd done a legitimate job in trying to screen things or make sure things were licensed and that sort of thing. So the notion that somebody's going to be chilled or afraid or unwilling to invest in the new economy online is mitigated to some degree. I think that's the inference that you're trying to make here. The third point does go directly after the one claim that the advocate presented about what the long-term impact would be, and you challenge the source of the information, suggesting there's potential bias there, that you have a question about how the hundreds of thousands of jobs estimate was arrived at. Those are reasonable presses. I do think that I thought that there was an explanation when I heard the argument before. I don't remember it well enough to say for sure that it was really mostly about the creativity process and how that's benefited things. I do like kind of the summary argument where you say it's possible to be perfectly creative online without having to use somebody else's words or material and surrender control of those things just to any Joe Schmo who walks by. I didn't mean Joe Schmo, I meant Joe, anybody. I thought the summary did a pretty good job kind of telling us what your argument was. Like I said, I think you need to be a little bit more precise in pointing at some of the arguments that they made, but you had good counterclaims. All right, thank you.